Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Psychiatric Exile. This week, we continue our exploration of The Shining. In the first parts of this series, we concentrated on the character of Danny, and this time we're going to be concentrating on explaining Jack. I think while Danny's character arc is pretty much Freudian in nature, for Jack, his character arc is Jungian in nature. Like Jung says, we can read here in this quote: "Every man carries within himself the eternal image of woman. This is a hereditary factor of primordial origin." So, what Jung is talking about here is his concept of the anima. And the anima is the feminine aspect of a man's psyche. In the case of a woman, she wouldn't have an anima, she would have an animus. It would be the masculine aspect of a woman's psyche. Now, in a man, the anima is repressed. It goes into the unconscious, and it becomes associated with the shadow. The shadow in Jungian theory is the totality of the unconscious. Part of that shadow is what we leave behind when consciousness emerges, and part of the shadow are the things that we repressed throughout the development of that consciousness. So, in Jung's theory, development continues across the lifespan, unlike in Freudian theory, where after adolescence, when you reach the genital stage, there's no other Freudian uh, developmental stage after that. But Jung says that development continues across the lifespan, and in middle age, which is where Jack is when we encounter him in the movie, the main task of a man's psychological development is to incorporate his anima and his shadow into his psyche. You don't want to continue to be unconscious about these aspects, to have them repressed and not contribute to your life. You want to incorporate them into your psyche, into your consciousness, so that they can contribute to a more balanced psyche and a richer life. This is different than so incorporating the shadow into the psyche, into your conscious psyche, is different than identifying with the shadow. And unfortunately, identifying with the shadow is what Jack did. He gave up his individuality and just submitted to the dark forces of the unconscious. Now, I'm not going to go over this in detail. These are the same slides that I used for the Danish video. You're welcome to read the notes here. And if you want to see a more detailed explanation, you're welcome to watch this part of Danny's video. I'm going to link that in the description below. Now, let's go over the Jungian theory we're going to need for this interpretation. First, according to Jung, there are four psychological functions, and they organize in two pair of opposites. Thinking and feeling is one pair of opposites. Sensation and intuition is another pair of opposites. The reason why he thinks there are four psychological functions, I'm not going to go into detail over this. I mean, he writes a whole book about it. I'll give you only the most basic of summaries. But he documents that throughout history, in myth and visions, in the dreams of patients, throughout cultures, there is a recurrence of the number four in association with symbols of totality or wholeness. That's one thing. And he says, I I came up with these four functions because Sensation tells you if something exists, thinking tells you what it is, feeling tells you whether it's good or not, and intuition tells you where it's coming from and where it's going. And once you know those four things about an object, you've described it pretty much in totality. And that's why he came up with these four psychological functions. The thing is, everybody, according to Jung, has a dominant function. In the case of Jack, that would be thinking. And the opposite of that function, which in this case is feeling, becomes repressed and unconscious. So you have the dominant function in consciousness, thinking for Jack, and the undifferentiated function is unconscious. The other two, which in this case are sensation and intuition, are auxiliary functions, and as such, they are partly conscious and partly unconscious. The undifferentiated conscious function, that in the case of Jack again is feeling, because it's repressed, it's in the unconscious, it's an unconscious function. It becomes associated with the anima and the shadow. Remember when the anima, we were explaining earlier, when the anima becomes repressed, it becomes associated with the shadow. Well, something similar happens with the undifferentiated function. Feeling for Jack becomes associated with the anima and the shadow. And as such, because feeling is undifferentiated, his ability to relate is compromised. His empathy is undeveloped. He has poor insight, poor emotional maturity. These are all the implications of the fact that the feeling function is undifferentiated and repressed. So again, Jack's task in middle age is going to be to loosen the control of reason and integrate some feeling, some of his anima, some of his shadow into his conscious life to live a more complete life. If we think about where Jack was psychologically um, uh, during the time of the movie, we see someone that, like I said before, had a dominant thinking function and a neglected feeling function, and that usually leads, according to Jung, to a lack of psychological insight. Someone who's prone to anger and irritability and has violent mood swings. In fact, we know that Danny had suffered violence at the hands of Jack, and we see Jack being emotionally abusive towards Wendy. He's dismissive, he treats her with contempt, his demeaning of her as a person and as a spouse. And in fact, in the picture we see here, when he was giving a tour of the facilities, we see two female employees vacating the facility, and he takes a second look at them as if he liked what he saw. Even though Wendy's there, he's showing no respect to her as a spouse and as a woman. We know that he blames Wendy for his lack of success. He tells her, I've let you fuck up everything in my life so far, but you're not going to fuck this up, meaning what he perceived to be an opportunity to write a great book. And he's someone that lacks empathy, even towards his family. When he's asked how his family were going to handle being isolated in the hotel for the winter, he says, "Oh, they're going to love it," meaning I'm going to love it. This is good for me, and they better get with the program. But he never really takes into consideration how they may actually feel about it. So when you marry, you're letting someone in your life that now is going to be as important as you are in your own life. And when you have children, then you're bringing people into your life that are going to be more important than yourself. And it seems to me that Jack could never accept these changes that come with getting married and having children, he always saw himself as number one, and he didn't want to give up what you need to give up in order to make family life work and function. So throughout the movie, we see Jack's descent into his own unconscious, and this is represented by the gold room as well as room 237. In fact, in the gold room, he encounters Lloyd, who is a figure of a psychopomp, and Jung describes this as the guide that helps the main character in his journey throughout the netherworld. And during the first visit to the gold room, Jack is the only person there besides Lloyd, and he has no money. The second visit happens after Wendy accuses him of having hurt Danny, and the room is now crowded. These are all rich people, important people. Everybody recognizes Jack. He feels like he belongs there. He does not even have to pay for his drink, even though now he has money in the wallet. This is a compensation for his low self-esteem, and in fact, he's told, "You are the important one." When he spills the drink on Grady, uh, so this is all a representation of the psychological compensation of someone who had very low self-esteem, self-esteem that was low and decreasing by the minute. And throughout the movie, we see Jack being confronted both with his personal unconscious, and for example, the figure of Grady is a representation of Jack's shadow. When Jack first meets Grady, he tells him that he seemed familiar, like he's seen him before, he knows him. And Grady tells him, "I have always been here." They're both caretakers, and Grady killed his family, which is what Jack probably has fantasized unconsciously at some unconscious level of doing in some form in the past, maybe making his family disappear or abandoning them. And soon he's going to be given the task of, quote, taking care of his family, unquote. And we know what that translates to. And also, Jack is confronted by his by the collective unconscious. And in room 237, he encounters the anima, first as a seductive figure, but then in its real neglected state. Jack's anima is neglected and deformed and grotesque because he never tended to this part of his psyche, and he can only see the real shape the anima is in when he looks at her in the mirror. And like we saw in the case of Danny, looking at something in the mirror and seeing its true nature is it's symbolic, a representation of the unconscious contents of your mind that you cannot see directly at face value. They require an interpretation because of their symbolic nature. And around this time, we see Wendy encountering the work that Jack was creating, and it's just a repetition of all work and no play make Jack. Most of the lines end up with a dull boy, but a couple of them have variations of this. One of them says adult boy, and another one a dull boy. And what we see here, we see three things. A dull boy is how Jack sees himself. That his life is dull. He's giving up fun, freedom, success in order to assume this dull, boring life of the adult that he resents. Um, and then the second one, adult boy, is what he wants to be. He wants to still be having fun as an adult, like he had in his youth, and be carefree and independent, and not have these attachments that he feel weigh him down. And a deal boy, which is what he actually is, the mess that he's made up with his life. So after the confrontation with Wendy, Jack is locked up in the freezer. And the freezer, I think, it's a representation of psychological stagnation. Remember when Jack encountered the anima in room 237, he ran away, he locked the room, and he denied that anything had happened. So this is a representation of him locking up the anima, repressing the anima for good. There's no, this is the point of no return. There's no turning back from this action now. So, as a result of that, he's psychologically stagnated, and he also failed to accomplish the task of disposing of his family. Therefore, he's psychologically stagnated, he's locked in, he cannot move forward. And one of the things that fans of the movie often discuss is how did he escape from this situation? Who opened up the freezer? And I think because this is symbolic in nature, the important question is not how did this happen, like who literally opened the freezer. I think the important question is what does it mean? And what it means, I think, is that having reached this point of psychological stagnation, Jack is only Jack resolves this situation, solves this problem by identifying with his shadow. So he accepts the duty that Grady gives him. Yes, now I'm more than willing to kill my family. He identifies with his shadow, Grady, the man that had killed his own family. And when he does that, by identifying with the shadow, he now has the psychological resources, the libido, the vitality to move forward. That's why the door opens up and he moves forward to kill Wendy, which is his spouse, is the person that he has projected his anima to. And he had already repressed his psychological anima. Now he wanted to eliminate the person that the anima had been projected to. And he is, of course, unsuccessful, and he dies in the maze. We had seen him looking at the maze, a model, miniature model of the maze earlier in the movie. And like we saw in the video about Danny, solving the maze is a symbol of initiation into adulthood. And for Jack, this task of balancing his psyche as an adult, and he's unable to do that. He fails at this task. So he dies in the maze. He freezes to death. This is another symbol of becoming psychologically stagnated, this time forever, for good. Done. And because he had chosen to identify with his shadow, once he becomes psychologically stagnated, he becomes psychologically stagnated in what state? He becomes psychologically stagnated in a state of identification with his shadow, which is why he is quote unquote absorbed by the hotel, and he is showing the pose of the Baphomet. We see the Baphomet here, classic symbol of the shadow in Western civilization. So this is what Jack becomes psychologically. He is he has identified with his shadow. He becomes psychologically stagnated. This is psychological death, which is represented by him dying in the maze, frozen to death in the maze. The picture says 1921. I think that's symbolic of the fact that Jack is now in the atemporal state, in an atemporal state, and frozen in time. So, um, part of the greatness of this movie, among other things, is that Kubrick did what I think was a completely Freudian character arc for Danny and a completely Jungian character arc for Jack. And we know that he liked both. He was a fan of Freud and he was a fan of Jung. So I'm not surprised by this. Wendy, Wendy, I haven't figured out yet. I suspect that her arc is basically someone who going from someone who's dependent and has been abused in the past to someone that's self-reliable and independent by the end of the movie. I suspect that Wendy was sexually molested as a child. I think that's why he saw um, the the bear in a sexual position in the room, and a big puzzle of this movie is why there was a similar bear in Danny's bed. I suspect it has to do with something along the lines of her fear that Danny would ever be put in the same situation that she had to go through. So, as usual, thank you for your time. I'll be doing the analysis of some other classic horror pictures in the near future. Probably the and some anime too, but probably the in terms of pictures, the Exorcist would be next, and that's a doozy. So I hope you guys enjoyed this one and join me again in the future. You take care of yourselves, and thank you for your time.